Welcome back to Bay's Bible. In order to embrace the somberness of the spirit of Lent, we are going to refrain from our usual levity. Our short lesson for the overall season of Lent is: Lent is about fighting against temptation and God's plan of salvation to save us from sin. Now, we have mentioned that over the next several weeks, we are going to be looking at promissory and obligatory covenants in the Hebrew Bible as we look forward to the establishment of the new covenant in Christ. Last week, we looked at the parallel between the covenant that God made with Noah after the great flood, that God would never again send such a great flood upon the world, and how this covenant paralleled our Christian baptism. Now, this week, we are going to be looking at another promissory covenant that God makes, but this time to Abraham. This is the Abrahamic covenant. And the promise that God makes to Abraham is, Abraham, I'm going to give you and your descendants the inheritance of the entire world. And God makes this promise in response to Abraham's display of faith. Now, we have to give some sympathy to the compilers of our lectionary, for the entire story of the Abrahamic covenant is covered in chapters 12, 15, and 17 of the book of Genesis. Far too much to cover in just one lesson. So in order to really dig in, we're going to have a little brief recap of the entire story of Abraham as is laid out in the book of Genesis. So, after the great flood, we have the nations get together to build the Tower of Babel, and God curses this project and sends the nations abroad to go and fill the whole earth. And in the midst of this, God calls a very special man, Abram, out of his father's land and says, Abram, I'm going to make you a great nation, and the land of Canaan is going to be your inheritance. Then, after some comedic mishaps that put this entire project of God's into jeopardy, Abraham confesses to God that he has some doubts about whether God is going to be able to fulfill his promise or not. And in chapter 15 of the book of Genesis, we see that God makes a covenant ritual with Abraham. And the covenant ritual that happens across the ancient Near East is you have an animal, you sacrifice it, then you split the animal apart, and then the parties walk between the sacrifice in order to seal the deal. And what's crucial in chapter 15 of the book of Genesis is that God alone passes through this sacrifice in a flame of fire, thus guaranteeing to Abram that the covenant is sealed by God's own unconditional promise to Abram. It is a promissory covenant. There is nothing that Abram has to do in order to secure the covenant. And in chapter 15, we get a very crucial verse, verse 6. This verse is very crucial to our epistle reading later. And in this verse we read that that is Abram, believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to Abram as righteousness. So God reckons to Abraham righteousness because of Abram's faith. Then later in chapters 16 and 17, we see that Abram tries to fulfill God's promise to him by his own means. That is, fathering Ishmael from his slave woman Hagar. And God says, no, Abram, I'm going to fulfill my promise through your elderly, infertile wife, Sarah. To which both Abraham and Sarah are like, there's no way that's going to happen, right? Chapter 17 of the book of Genesis can feel repetitive because it communicates a lot of the same information of chapters 12 and 15. But certain new details are introduced. So firstly, you'll notice that previously in chapters 12 and 15 of the book of Genesis, the covenant that God is making with Abraham is purely promissory. But now, in verse 1 of our passage, it seems to suggest that there is now some obligation on Abram's part. Secondly, in the previous scenes of chapters 12 and 15, we see that God promises Abram to make of him a great nation. But now, in chapter 17, we see that God promises to Abram to make him the father of many nations. Thirdly, the matriarch of this arrangement is only now clearly indicated to be Sarah, despite her infertility and old age. Finally, the fourth detail introduced here is that this covenant will be everlasting. Now, our friend, who we introduced last week, Nahum M. Sarna, in his commentary on the book of Genesis, makes a very interesting point about what walking before God and being blameless is all about. He notes that this seems to have been a technical term in the ancient Near East to denote absolute loyalty to a king. So it denotes absolute loyalty or faithfulness to a king or sovereign. Furthermore, the term for blameless is also earlier used of Noah. And this is a weird term to apply to a person because it is used in the context of sacrificial offerings to be blameless. So Sarna notes that later rabbis would interpret Abraham's walking before God in blamelessness as Abram having faith in God and then performing the act of circumcision as the sign of God's promise to him, that he would be physically unblemished like Noah was. So we see that there's this absolute loyalty and faith and then the sign of the circumcision. Secondly, when God has now promised to expand from Abram one great nation to many great nations, we later do see in chapters 25 and 36 of the book of Genesis that Abraham is the father to many different nations around the ancient Near East, like the Midianites, the Edomites, and the Ishmaelites, and many, many others. Third, the matriarch here, Sarah. See, Abram laughs at this because Abram says that, he's about 100 years old and she's close to 90. So, how is that going to happen? And no shame to mothers that have children late. My personal mother was 40 years old when she had me, so it's not a knock on that. But Abram's basically saying, she's 90. She's basically dead at this point. How can she bring forth new life from the dead? Finally, in this last note about the everlasting nature of this covenant, this is also how the covenant with Noah is characterized. It is characterized as everlasting. So, now we're going to conclude with a lesson about God. See, normally at Base Bible, we like to end each lesson with how we should respond to a particular reading and how we move forward in responding to the reading. But because during the season of Lent, we are looking at the things that God has done to deal with our sin. We are looking particularly at truths about God as how he has dealt with our sin. And what we can see with the Abrahamic covenant is that God has made an everlasting promise to bless all the nations of the world by bringing forth life from the dead. We have previously seen how our psalm is positioned to be a response to our Old Testament reading, and clearly this psalm is a very fitting response to our Old Testament reading, for it celebrates God's faithfulness to Abraham and Sarah. Because we see that God has listened to the affliction of infertility of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham fulfills his vow to the Lord by performing circumcision. All the families of the earth that Abraham has sired will come and worship the God of Israel. Those who were close to death, like Abraham and Sarah were, shall worship, and Abraham's future offspring shall rejoice in the inheritance that God has left for them. It is clearly a very congruent psalm. A lot of the elements here are clearly present in the story of Abraham and Sarah. But Psalm 22 is also a psalm of David. It is ascribed to David. And most interestingly, our Gospels see this psalm as a whole as a prefiguring of what would happen to Christ on the cross. Indeed, Christ quotes the first verse of this psalm from the cross. So in some sense then, the later section of this psalm that we are reading here together is almost a prefiguring of Christ's resurrection. Indeed, it is sometimes a lovely exercise to take a psalm and to read it as if it were spoken from Christ's own mouth. In fact, take a second here to pause the video, reread this psalm, but to think about it as if it were spoken from the mouth of Christ resurrected. It's pretty stunning, isn't it? To read it that way, to read it as if it were from Jesus' perspective. Now, unfortunately, we can't spend too much more time on our psalm this week because our epistle reading is really thick and we have to spend some extra time on it. But hopefully you can see that even reading this psalm from the perspective of its celebration of God's faithfulness to Abraham and Sarah, as well as from the perspective of the resurrected Christ, that our psalm is teaching us to respond to it during the respond with it during the season of Lent, to praise and celebrate the God who listens to our prayers during times of trial and temptation. Now, truly, our epistle is at the heart of our passages this week. So we're going to spend a little extra time on our epistle this week because there's a lot to get into. First, we're going to look at the political situation into which St. Paul is writing. In 49 CE, the Roman Emperor Claudius has decided to expel the Judean population from the city of Rome because apparently they were always making trouble at the instigation of a certain Christus. I wonder who that could be. So they're making all this trouble and Claudius expels them. Then, when Claudius dies and his stepson Nero ascends to become Roman emperor, Nero decides that he's going to show how good and merciful he is in contrast to the previous Claudius by reversing Claudius's policy and thus allowing the Judeans to return to Rome. So when St. Paul is writing the epistle to the Romans, he is writing into a situation in which the church is largely made up of non-Jewish people that are experiencing the return of the newly ashamed and disgraced Judeans that had been previously expelled from the city. So St. Paul is saying, okay, how are these two ethnic groups going to get along in the Christian church? And the task that St. Paul is going to set forward then is not contrasting Jewish salvation by works versus Christian salvation by faith, but rather how God is being faithful to Israel despite their recent shaming. And he's doing this by fulfilling the covenant that God made to Abraham in and through Jesus Christ. So this is where the interpretation of the entire epistle to the Romans can come shining forth. And I'm taking this interpretation largely from N.T. Wright's 2-volume work, Paul and the Faithfulness of God. So we can see that in chapter 3, St. Paul is decimating any idea that the non-Judeans or the Judeans have any rights to boast toward the other group. So St. Paul is taking away the idea that any of them have privilege over the other. Okay, because St. Paul wants to show that God's faithfulness to the Judeans in fulfilling the covenant of Abraham is going to be done not by keeping the law of Moses, which the Judeans couldn't do and the Gentiles knew nothing about, but rather through faith. And the Greek word here for faith is pistis, which we could also translate as loyalty or allegiance. Remember, during our Genesis passage, when we saw how walking before God was like being loyal or showing allegiance and faithfulness to the God of Israel. So this is what St. Paul is trying to set forth. He's trying to show how we can all, Judean and non-Judean alike, share in the promises that God made to Abraham to bless all the nations if we keep the same faith that Abraham did. And thus, in chapter 4, St. Paul is trying to show that Abraham is not just an example of what it means to have faith, but is actually the father of all nations, of any and all nations, of those that share in the faith that sealed the Abrahamic covenant in the first place. So all of that is what comes before the 4 in verse 13 of our passage. So St. Paul's conclusion then, is the righteousness of God is coming through faith, is coming through faithfulness to the God of Israel. And then in verses 14 and 15, we see St. Paul making the logical point that if righteousness, if being part of the people of God, is constituted by keeping the law of Moses, then Abraham himself could not be a part of it, because Abraham was reckoned as righteous before the law of Moses even showed up on the scene. And this is where N.T. Wright's reading really shines, because he's trying to show that in verses 16 and 17 of this passage, that's normally put into brackets when St. Paul is quoting from Genesis 17, that this should not be in brackets. For this is St. Paul's central point, is that Abraham is the father of many nations if those people in those many nations hold to the same faith that Abraham did. And what is Abraham's faith? The faith in the God who can bring life from the dead. So it is this belief in the resurrection of Jesus that St. Paul is saying can unite all nations in God's fulfilling of his promises to Abraham. Last week, we saw Christ fight against Satan and his temptations in the wilderness. And in this week, we see Jesus engaging in that same fight, but this time in the figure of Peter. Now, the reason why Christ is in such an angry state in our scene is because only just moments earlier, Peter was the one disciple that gave the correct confession as to who Jesus was, the Messiah. Thus, the reason that Christ is so angry is because Peter made the right confession, but is now not being faithful to Jesus. Indeed, the verb here for rebuke in the Greek is epitemason. And this is a really interesting verb in the Gospel of Mark, because this verb is also what Jesus uses to silence demons earlier in the Gospel of Mark, like we saw for week 4 of Epiphany. So when Peter and Jesus are rebuking each other, they are engaged in a battle of spiritual proportions. This exchange is really Christ fighting against the satanic temptation to abandon his vocation, because Christ came to die and to give his life for others. Now, normally for human beings, the instinct to preserve one's own life is a very good instinct, and one which we're not called to abandon easily. But for Christ, to give into this would have been temptation, because paradoxically it would have meant him giving up the very thing for which he was born. Now, during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, our society as a whole has been given a really interesting question. What is most important to you? And clearly, the preservation of bodily life, as well of ourselves, as well as our neighbors, has come to be a top contender for an answer to that question of what's most important. And indeed, that's a good and noble thing. I think we should weigh the lives of our fellow citizens higher than our right to hold a backyard party or, to go to school necessarily, right? There are ways to measure these things out. But If that was the only question our time posed to each other, we would have passed it pretty easily. We shut down a lot of our lives to save lives. And who knows how much worse things might have been if we didn't do these things. But we've been given actually more of a stronger test. We've been given a greater final examination, which is not only what is most important to you, but what is that thing which is so important to you that you would willingly give up the possibility of continuing your bodily life for? What is that which is so important to your life that it'd be worth giving up your life to do? And it is the only thing that makes your life have any meaning at all and make it worth living. For some, this was the cause of racial justice. It was protesting against the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and they would march hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. And clearly these were against COVID health regulations to have such great gatherings. But for these people that were protesting, they were saying, no, this cause is so important. It is so important for Black people to be able to have racial equality and equity in society that I will willingly take the risk of catching COVID-19 and dying in order to promote this cause. It is that important to me. For others, it was seeing their loved ones, whether in the hospital or for the holidays or anywhere else. It was so important to see your loved ones that they were going to take the risk, even if it meant public shame and embarrassment or however risky the travel was. For others still, it was their businesses. They said, listen, I have employees who are trying to feed their families. I'm going to keep my business open. I understand that there's risks here, but I need to make a living. I need to have meaningful work throughout the day. So I'm going to keep my business open, even if it means heavy fines. For others still, probably the most noble, the frontline workers, for them it was, my vocation is to care for other people, even if it means at the risk of my own life. And for the Christian, this answer should have been super clear throughout this time, that it is Jesus Christ and his gospel, which is the thing that we should be willing to give up our own lives for pursuing, because they are the only things that made this life worth living. Amazingly, in verse 36, we get Christ's rhetorical question that it would not be worth to gain the entire world if it meant losing that very thing which it was worth living our lives for, our souls. Remember that Abraham and Romans were suggesting that we would inherit the entire world if we believed in the God who raised the dead. Well, now here in our gospel passage, we are getting a firm suggestion of what it means to hold that faith. It means to be willing to give up your life. And last week, we saw that Christ went into the wilderness after baptism to face temptations and how we were to go with him into those places. And this week, we are being called also to follow him to the cross. But like our journey into the wilderness to face temptation, so too will we not go alone in our journey to the cross. Saint Caesarius of Arles, who was a 5th century bishop and very popular preacher, really drives home this point for us and gives us great encouragement for our Lenten journey as we continue to the cross. And with this, we will close. When the Lord tells us in the gospel that anyone who wants to be his follower must renounce himself, the injunction seems harsh. We think he is imposing a burden on us. But an order is no burden when it is given by one who helps in carrying it out. To what place are we to follow Christ, if not where he has already gone? We know that he has risen and ascended into heaven. There then we must follow him. There is no cause for despair. By ourselves we can do nothing, but we have Christ's promise. Well, that is us here for this week. Thank you for joining us. Our short lesson for the overall season of Lent has been Lent is about fighting against temptation and God's plan of salvation to save us from sin. And for the second week of Lent, we have looked at the link between the covenant that God made with Abraham and our faith in the God who raises the dead. And we've seen this particularly in 4 ways with our passages. God makes an everlasting promise to bless all the nations of the world by bringing forth life from the dead. To praise and celebrate the God who listens to our prayers during our times of trial and temptation. To hold the faith in the God who brings life from the dead. To go with Christ to the cross. Friends, thanks again for coming week after week. I really appreciate it. Please remember to share, to like, subscribe, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all the information down below in the description of every video. Please consider becoming a Patreon subscriber as well. I would really appreciate it to continue this work, to take time off work and to advertise and everything else to do this project. So please consider becoming a supporter. We'll see you here again next week for our 3rd week of Lent as we look at the Mosaic covenant. Blessings to you.